The first thing I heard was my own name. Not my son's voice. Not my daughter-in-law's. Just a stranger's, a woman I'd never met. Saying, ma'am, can you hear me? And the fluorescent light above me was so bright it hurt, and I didn't know where I was, and my chest felt like someone had parked a car on it. I was at the grocery store. That's where it happened. Not at church, not somewhere dramatic. I was reaching for a can of soup chicken noodle, the low-sodium kind my doctor told me to switch to. And then I was on the floor, and a young woman in a Kroger vest was crouching over me, and her name tag said Felicia, and she was holding my hand so tight. I'm 67 years old. I live alone. I've lived alone since my husband passed 8 years ago, and I've been fine. I want you to understand that before I tell you everything else. I've been fine. I drove myself to doctor's appointments. I kept the gutters clean. I planted tomatoes every spring. I was not a woman who needed saving, but on that Tuesday in October, I needed saving, and the person who should have come didn't. The paramedics said my heart went into something called atrial fibrillation. The way they explained it, my heart just lost its rhythm, forgot what it was supposed to be doing. They got it back in the ambulance. By the time I arrived at St. Vincent's, I was conscious and terrified and asking for my son. His name is Wesley. He's 38. He lives 40 minutes away. 40 minutes. I know because I've driven it 100 times, bringing him casseroles he never asked for, showing up on holidays with gifts for the grandchildren I barely know. 40 minutes. The ER nurse, a heavy-set man named Trevor with a tattoo of a compass on his forearm, he's the one who started calling. He told me later, much later, that he called Wesley 11 times in the first hour. 11 calls. Not once did the phone even ring through. It went straight to voicemail every time. He left messages. Detailed ones, he said. Your mother has been brought in by ambulance. She's had a cardiac event. Please call St. Vincent's immediately. Nothing. He tried my daughter-in-law, Kendall. Her phone rang. And rang. Nothing. I lay in that hospital bed with wires on my chest and a blood pressure cuff that squeezed my arm every 15 minutes, and I told myself there was a reason. There had to be a reason. Wesley was probably in a meeting. Kendall was probably driving. These things happen. People don't always have their phones. I told myself that for 6 hours. The person who actually came was my neighbor. Her name is Wanda, and she's 71, and she has a bad hip and drives a 2009 Honda that sounds like it's gargling marbles. She found out because Felicia, the Kroger girl, she'd looked in my wallet, found my library card, and somehow tracked down my address, and she knocked on Wanda's door because the lights were on. Wanda called her daughter to come watch her grandkids, and then she drove that marble-gargling Honda 35 minutes to St. Vincent's and walked into my room with a Ziploc bag of crackers and a crossword puzzle book, and she said, "Well, you scared the daylights out of me." I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. I cried the way you cry when you've been holding it together for 6 hours and suddenly someone you love walks in and your body just gives up pretending. She sat with me all night. She slept in that plastic chair with her coat over her lap and her shoes still on. And in the morning, when the cardiologist came in to explain what had happened and what came next, Wanda was the one who asked the questions I was too foggy to think of. She wrote everything down in the back of the crossword puzzle book. Wesley still hadn't called. It was the cardiologist, Dr. Tend Pemberton, a small, serious woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, who finally reached him. She called from her personal cell phone and left a message that was, I'm told, considerably less polite than Trevor's. She said something to the effect of, "Your mother has been hospitalized with a serious cardiac event. If you have any interest in being involved in her care decisions, I suggest you return this call before noon." He called back at 11:47. By then, it had been almost 20 hours. "Mom," he said when the nurse handed me the phone. "Mom, I am so sorry. I had no idea. My phone, I was at this work retreat up in the mountains. There was no reception. I just got back." I said, "Okay." And he said, "Are you all right?" What happened? The doctor left me this message. I said, I'm stable. Dr. Pemberton can explain. And then I handed the phone back to the nurse because I didn't have the energy for his voice right then. I didn't have the energy to perform the relief he needed me to feel. Wanda looked at me over her crossword puzzle book and didn't say a word. She just pressed her lips together in that way she has and went back to 7 across. He showed up that afternoon. Wesley, in a fleece pullover with his company's logo on it and running shoes that still looked clean. He brought flowers, gas station flowers, the kind in the plastic sleeve, and he stood in the doorway of my room like he was waiting for permission to enter. I told him to come in. He hugged me. He smelled like pine trees and hotel shampoo. He said he was so sorry. He said it 3 or 4 times. He said the retreat had been in a dead zone. He said he'd felt terrible when he saw all the missed calls. He said Kendall sent her love and would have come, but the kids had school. I listened to all of it. And then this is the part I keep coming back to. I said, Wesley, it's fine. Because what else do you say? He's my son. He's the only one I have. You don't look your child in the eye and say you let me almost die alone on a grocery store floor, and I will never forget that. You don't say that. So I said it was fine. He stayed for an hour and a half. He left before dinner because he had an early meeting. Wanda stayed for 3 days. I was discharged on a Thursday. Wanda drove me home in the marble gargling Honda. She'd already been to my house while I was in the hospital, watered my plants, brought in the mail, set up the pill organizer on my kitchen counter with labels for each day. She'd even made a small pot of soup and left it in the refrigerator. When I walked into my own house and saw all of that, the organized mail, the soup, the pills lined up just right. I stood in my kitchen and I couldn't move for a full minute. I didn't hear from Wesley for 4 days after I came home. Not a call, not a text, not an email. On the 5th day, I was sitting on my back porch, which is where I go when I need to think, and my phone buzzed with a text from Kendall. It said, "Hope you're feeling better. Wesley said you're doing great. We should get together soon." I looked at that text for a long time. She'd sent it with a little heart emoji. I put the phone face down on the porch railing and watched a cardinal land on my bird feeder. And I thought, they weren't at a retreat. It was a feeling more than anything else. That particular kind of knowing you don't want to have. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone and won't be reasoned away. I called Wesley's assistant, a young man named Patrick, who's been with the company 3 years and has always been kind to me, and I asked if Wesley had been at a retreat in the mountains last week. I said I was asking because I was trying to send a thank you note to whoever organized it. Patrick paused. Just a half second too long. Then he said, "Mrs. Holloway, I don't think Mr. Holloway had any scheduled travel last week." I thanked him. I told him not to mention the call. Wanda came over that evening. I didn't plan to tell her. I made tea and set out the good cups. And I thought I would just keep this to myself, the way I'd been keeping things to myself for years. But she took one look at me and said, "What happened?" So I told her. She held her teacup with both hands and listened to all of it, and when I was done, she said, "So, he was home, or somewhere with reception." And he just didn't answer. I said I thought so. She said, "And Kendall too." I said probably. Wanda set down her teacup very carefully. She said, "Do you remember when my Albert was sick, the last year?" I said I remembered. She said, "You brought me dinner 43 times. I counted. I wrote it in a little book because I didn't want to forget." She paused. "You sat with him that one night so I could sleep. You held his hand. I hadn't thought about that in years." I said, "That was nothing, Wanda." She said, "It was not nothing." We sat with that for a while. The weeks after coming home from the hospital are strange when you've had a cardiac event. Your body feels like borrowed property. You walk slowly, you take the stairs with both hands on the rail. You lie in bed at night and you listen to your own heartbeat, really listen, in a way you never did before, and you try to trust it. Wesley called once a week, short calls, 10 minutes, always at 7 p.m. On Sundays, like I was an item on his to-do list. He asked how I was feeling. I said fine. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. We talked about his children's school activities. We talked about the weather. We talked about nothing. The way you do in a conversation is really just two people proving they made the call. I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. He hadn't come to see me after I got home. Not once in the first month. He lived 40 minutes away. The last time I'd seen my grandchildren, Cody and Ava, 9 and 7, was at Easter, 7 months ago. The last time Wesley had come to my house without me suggesting it first was, I actually couldn't remember. I started going through my phone, looking at the record of calls. How many had I made versus received? Who reached out first? It's a depressing exercise and I don't recommend it, but I needed to see the truth laid out in some concrete way because I'd been explaining it away for so long. In 14 months, I had called Wesley 62 times. He had called me 9. There's a community center about a mile from my house. I'd driven past it 1,000 times without going in. But my cardiologist had said I needed low-impact exercise and social interaction. She said it with the same clinical directness she brought to everything. So one morning in November, I walked in. That's where I met a woman named Claudette. Claudette is 64, and she walks with a cane, and she laughs louder than anyone I've ever met. She'd lost her husband 2 years before, and she had no children, and she had apparently decided that if life was going to be hard, she was at least going to be entertained. She was leading a chair yoga class when I walked in, and she waved me over with her cane like she'd been expecting me. We had coffee afterward. Then lunch the following week. Then she started calling to check in. Just quick calls. How are you? Did you take your pills? I saw this ridiculous thing at the grocery store you need to hear about. She drove me to my cardiologist follow-up because I mentioned I was nervous to drive that far alone yet. She sat in the waiting room and did a word search puzzle. And when I came out, she looked up and said, "Well?" And I said the doctor was pleased with my progress. And Claudette said, "Obviously, you're a very sturdy woman." And somehow I laughed for the first time in weeks. My son had not come to a single appointment. In December, Wesley called on a Sunday and said he wanted to talk about something. His voice had that particular careful quality, the one he'd had since he was a teenager when he wanted something and was trying to figure out how to ask. He said that he and Kendall had been doing some financial planning. He said they were thinking about putting an addition on their house, a sunroom. The kids would love it. He said the contractor estimates were higher than expected. Then he said, "I know Dad left you the house and the savings. I know you're comfortable. I was wondering if you might consider." I let him finish. I let him lay out the whole thing. The addition, the estimate, the investment in our family's future. The hint that it would benefit me too, because I'd have a nice place to visit. When he was done, I said, "Wesley, I was in the hospital for 3 days. You didn't come until the second day and you left before dinner." Silence. I said, "I called you 11 times when your father was dying. You answered every time. You drove through a snowstorm. Do you remember that?" He said yes, very quietly. I said, "I need you to tell me the truth about the retreat." More silence. Longer this time. Then he said, "Mom." I said, "Were you home?" He said, "It's complicated." I said, "I see." He started talking something about stress, about needing to disconnect, about Kendall's anxiety, about how he'd meant to call but then kept putting it off because he didn't know what to say. And the more time passed, the harder it got. He said he knew it was wrong. He said he was sorry. I believed that he was sorry. I even believed that he hadn't meant for it to go as far as it did, that it had started as avoidance and turned into something he didn't know how to come back from. But sorry doesn't rewind 47 missed calls. Sorry doesn't unspin the night I lay in a hospital bed convincing myself there was a reason. I said, "I need some time, Wesley." He said, "Of course. Whatever you need." I said, "In the meantime, I'll be keeping my savings." He didn't say anything to that. I said, "I love you. Good night." And I hung up. I didn't sleep well that night. I want to be honest about that. There's no version of this where I felt powerful or triumphant. I felt sad. I felt the specific grief of seeing something clearly that you'd been choosing not to see, because seeing it means you have to decide what to do about it. I thought about my husband. He would have said, "Give the boys some grace, Eileen. People are complicated." That was his way. And I loved him for it. But I also knew that he would have been at that hospital. He would have driven through fire to be at that hospital. So would I, if it had been Wesley on that floor. I called Claudette in the morning. I told her what had happened, the whole thing, the call and what he'd asked for and what I'd said. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural inclination, and when I was done, she said, "Good." Just that. "Good." I said, "It doesn't feel good." She said, "No, but you'd feel worse if you'd said yes." Spring came. I planted tomatoes. I went to chair yoga twice a week, and Claudette and I started walking in the evenings, slow walks around the block with her cane and my new comfortable shoes. My cardiologist approved. Wesley called on Sundays. I answered. Our conversations were still careful, still short, but something had shifted. He asked more real questions. He asked what my doctor had said at my last appointment, and actually waited for the answer. He mentioned feeling ashamed about the retreat. I didn't reassure him, and I didn't pile on. I just said, "I know." He brought the kids over in April. Cody and Ava ran around my backyard, and Ava helped me water the tomatoes. And Cody, who has his grandfather's eyes, sat on the porch steps and told me very seriously about a book he was reading. Kendall was quiet, more quiet than usual, and at one point she found me in the kitchen and she said, "I'm sorry, Eileen, I should have answered." I said, "Yes, you should have." She nodded. She looked like she might cry. I handed her a dish towel and said, "Help me with these glasses." We didn't say anything else about it. But something shifted there too. I haven't given Wesley any money. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. Not as punishment, I don't think of it that way, but because I finally understood something sitting on that back porch watching the cardinal. I had been making myself small and available and endlessly generous for years, and it had not made us closer. It had just made me easier to take for granted. I'm not easy to take for granted anymore. I don't think that makes me a bad mother. I think it makes me a person who finally decided she was worth showing up for. Wanda came for dinner last week. I made her favorite pot roast, and we ate at the good table with candles. Because why not? Why save the candles? Claudette came too, and the three of us sat there past 10 o'clock, talking and laughing, and at some point Claudette said, "You know what you are, Eileen? You're a late bloomer." I said, "Excuse me, I am 67 years old." She said, "Exactly. You're blooming now." I thought about that afterward. I lay in bed listening to my heart still doing it. Still steady, still keeping its rhythm. And I thought, I almost died on a grocery store floor reaching for a can of soup. Nobody I gave birth to came. And somehow, on the other side of that, I am not lonelier than I was before. I am, strangely, less. There's a particular kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for someone to show up and start noticing who's already there. I'm still learning it, but I'm learning. My tomatoes are coming in beautifully this year. Wanda says I should enter them in the county fair. Claudette says I should sell them at the farmer's market. I say I'm going to eat them standing over the kitchen sink the way I've always liked, with a little salt, and not share them with anyone unless I feel like it. And I think my husband would laugh at that. I think he'd say, "There she is." I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that October afternoon on the Kroger floor. Not in any mystical way, just the plain observable kind. The kind where you trace a line from one choice backward through time and see all the smaller choices that made it possible. Wesley didn't ignore 11 calls in a single moment of cruelty. He got there slowly. He got there through years of me excusing the late replies, the missed birthdays, the Sunday calls I always made first. Every time I said it's fine when it wasn't, I was teaching him that it was fine. Every time I showed up with a casserole he didn't ask for and left without asking for anything in return, I was telling him I didn't need to be shown up for. I was so careful not to be a burden that I made myself invisible. That's the thing nobody tells you about being selfless to a fault. It doesn't actually protect the relationship. It just delays the moment when you find out what the relationship really is. I'm not saying this to excuse what he did. He made choices. Adults make choices, and the choice to silence a phone when your mother is in an ambulance is a choice that lives in a person. It tells you something true. But I also had to look at what I'd been doing for years. The way I'd been shrinking and accommodating and filling silences. And ask myself what I'd been hoping to buy with all that quiet. Wanda didn't get anything from me except friendship and 43 pots of dinner during a very hard year. And she drove 35 minutes in a car that sounds like it's falling apart. And she slept in a plastic hospital chair for 3 nights. And she organized my pill bottles with little handwritten labels. She didn't do that because she owed me. She did it because that's the kind of person she is. And because she knew I'd do it for her, not out of guilt or obligation, but because we actually see each other. That's what I'd been missing with my son, not love. I think he loves me in the way people love things they've stopped paying real attention to. But the being seen, the being worth the inconvenience. Claudette told me once over coffee at the community center that she thinks most people confuse comfort with love. They stay comfortable in relationships, comfortable taking, comfortable assuming, comfortable with the silence of someone who never complains. And they call it love because it doesn't hurt them. But love, real love, is the willingness to be inconvenienced, to answer the phone, to show up. I'm 67 years old and I finally understand what I want from the people in my life. I want to be someone's first call, not their afterthought. I want the people who know me to know that if their phone rang 11 times from a hospital, I would answer on the second. That's not a standard I invented for myself. That's just what it looks like when one person genuinely gives a damn about another. Wesley is learning that now. Slowly, imperfectly. But I see him trying. Cody and Ava came over last month and stayed for 4 hours. And that's not nothing. Kendall helped me with the dishes and said she was sorry, and I believed her. We're not repaired, but we're working. And I have Wanda, and I have Claudette, and I have tomatoes coming in on the back porch. And my heart, the actual physical one, is keeping steady time. That's enough. Some days it's more than enough.